So thank you, Cecilia. And we're very pleased to have Cecilia Kushner with us speaking today. For those of you who may not have read the bio in the announcement, it's well worth reviewing. Cecilia is the Executive Vice President for the Planning Division at New York City Economic Development Corporation. She leads large multidisciplinary teams delivering on some of the most ambitious and complex urban planning, development, and transportation projects in New York. As part of this role, she oversees over $1 billion of active projects geared towards delivering infrastructure and amenities and improving quality of life for New Yorkers across all 5 boroughs. She has 15 years of experience in urban planning, development, and resilience in New York City, London, and Paris. She has dedicated her career to executing significant initiatives that seek to improve global cities. Cecilia received a bachelor's degree from the Sorbonne and holds a master's degree in historic preservation from the Bartlett School of Planning at University College London, and a master's degree in city planning from Hunter College, where she has taught planning as an adjunct. I'm especially happy to welcome another part of the CUNY family into this network. Cecilia lives in Brooklyn. We're neighbors with her husband and 2 children. Cecilia, I look forward to hearing what you have to tell us today.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all of you for hosting me today. And again, really apologies for the technology issues here. I've been doing Zoom for 10 months and everything was smooth up until this very minute. It will go into the broad mystery of technology during COVID. One more to add to the list. So thank you again for having me. I have a presentation that probably will take me 20-30 minutes to walk you through one specific asset that the Economic Development Corporation owns and manages on behalf of the city, which is sitting into a neighborhood located in the South Bronx in Hunts Point. So I just want to walk you through the importance of this facility in the food supply and industrial business network of New York City, as well as the investment that the city is making in the facility itself and in the neighborhood more broadly at large. And then I want to leave enough time for questions to have a dialogue with all of you. And just specifically on ongoing projects, a lot of them relate to issues of infrastructure and freight in particular, as well as diversification of the type of businesses that we find in the food distribution center. And then finally, resiliency, as this is a neighborhood that is located in the floodplain. All right, so here is Hunts Point. It is a peninsula that is in the South Bronx and kind of divided from the Bronx itself by the Bruckner Expressway, which is an elevated highway in the way it sits in the neighborhood here. It's about 690 acres, and there are 3 distinct sub-areas within the entire neighborhood. We have the food distribution center. I'll refer to it as the FDC. So again, this is an asset that is owned by the city since the 1960s, 1970s, and that the Economic Development Corporation manages on behalf of the city. This entire neighborhood and the food distribution center in particular is the largest geographical food cluster in the city, and I will explain a little bit what that means. This is mainly an industrial neighborhood. About 50% of the land that you can see is dedicated to industrial businesses with a big emphasis on food, but not solely on food. And then we have a very small residential core at the center. This very small New York City geography employs a tremendous number of people. We have about 17,500 employees and a lot of businesses, a lot of them small businesses. So it is a really large, it is a really, from our point of view at EDC, a really important economic node for the entire city of New York and for the Bronx in particular, and employs a lot of Bronx residents. And it is a neighborhood that since like the 50s, 60s, like kind of post-World War II, like a lot of neighborhoods in the South Bronx have transitioned from being mainly white to mainly residents of color. And so in Hunts Point today, we have a really big Hispanic community as well as an African-American community. You can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So let me walk you through a little bit about the Food Distribution Center, which is the DC asset. So it was created in 1960 to consolidate street markets. As you can remember from like old movies, you used to have street markets mainly in Lower Manhattan, around the Fulton area, also around where the High Line is, where you had a lot of meat markets. So you really had them concentrated in what were historically kind of immigrant neighborhood and closer to where you had residential population in Lower Manhattan. And in the 1960s, similar to what we saw across the entire nation, there was a desire to better separate these businesses from residential areas. And so the city, as a result, developed a number of facilities and located them in Hunts Point because it had like a really large tract of land that was located there, that was close to a highway, so easy for kind of like truck traffic to come in and out, because at the time in the 1960s, it was seen as kind of like the ultimate future for transportation in the nation, taking advantage of kind of a nascent highway system post-war. So Hunts Point Peninsula is occupied by the Food Distribution Center. It's one of the largest distribution centers in the world. There's about 4.5 billion pounds of food that flows through it. But interestingly, that only represents about 12% of all of the food that is distributed in New York City. So what we've seen over the years is that there are a lot of other clusters that have formed throughout the city in the other boroughs, generally located in immigrant communities, serving sometimes ethnic food needs served by the Food Distribution Center. And we also have big clusters in New Jersey or in areas like surrounding the city where you have enormous, maybe sometimes more conducive to this type of development. As I said, Hunts Point, but the Food Distribution Center in particular is one of the largest employer in the Bronx, where we find about like north of 8,000 jobs. Something that's really important to us is many of them are unionized job. And so they are like good jobs that allow Bronx families to be able to have like a decent quality of life in the borough that they live and that they work. EDC owns the land of the Food Distribution Center, but the buildings themselves are owned by the actual different companies that occupy them, and they're responsible for their management. Interestingly, there are free cooperative markets, which is really an historic form of business functioning that existed prior to moving in the Food Distribution Center. So it's a model of kind of ownership that is fairly common in Europe, but still actually not really common in the US. And I think when it came to the US, it was really because it came through Europeans that brought it. And then over time, it actually has disappeared. But it is organized at the Food Distribution Center around 3 different markets: the produce market, the meat market, and the fish market. As their name really clearly states, one sells produce, one sells meat, and one sells fish. And because of its location in the harbor and in the Sound, and the fact that it is an active industrial area, the Food Distribution Center is also a significant maritime industrial area in the city, which means that like the city really tries to put forth policy that protects its ability to continue to function efficiently as an industrial area. So I'm just going to walk you through a little bit what we have going on right now that occupies us and that has been focus of the city for quite some time. So the first one is a marine barge terminal. So obviously, because the food distribution center is an enormous cluster for food for New York City and for the region, it generates a significant amount of truck traffic coming off the Bruckner, but also having to traverse like the residential around the residential industrial areas outside of the food distribution center. A lot of the work that the city has been trying to do over the last 15 to 20 years is diversify the transportation modes for freight in New York City, but in particular in our facilities, because sometimes we can have like a little bit more control because we own the land. Here we have the opportunity, because the food distribution center is on the waterfront, to look at a different type of freight, which is what we call the marine highway, which is the concept that you can transport goods from port to port within the United States. Right now, a lot of goods come to the US via global shipments, but really often once they arrive in the first port, BLA or New Jersey, Newark for the region here, then generally they get transferred into trucks and brought into kind of like secondary facilities for distribution to individuals or commerce. So the idea here was to get kind of a regional marine barge terminal that would allow goods that come throughout the eastern seashore, so like from Maine to Virginia, to actually make their way through the food distribution center directly by boat. And so we have a request for proposal out for companies to seek interest into becoming an operator and developing a barge terminal in the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center, with the idea to reduce truck congestion and improve air quality, because air quality in the neighborhood, because it is a highly industrial neighborhood and one that generates a lot of truck traffic, has historically been poor, and also to continue to support kind of good commerce and development of jobs. So we're continuing to evaluate this proposal. Of course, because of COVID, kind of global freight and even American freight has been incredibly disrupted. And so understanding on the other side of the pandemic, what are those kind of more profound changes that will be made to the industry is going to be really helpful to understand the viability of a project like this one. But this is one where we're very excited about. Next. Another one that we are really excited about and that we are hoping to close the finances for in the coming months is the Grow NYC Regional Food Hub. So you may know Grow NYC as the organization that helps organize the green markets throughout New York City, and basically create a network of upstate grocers and farmers to be able to directly sell their goods to New Yorkers in the city itself. So they're an organization that has an incredible network with upstate farmers, many of whom are of small size. And so they're really helping kind of grow kind of a organic, small scale type of farming in the States that is really important for high quality food, but also for different types of companies to have the ability to compete into what is like a very competitive farming business in the US. And so they will come and be a new tenant of the food distribution center. They will create a new building as part of this project. And there will be a larger warehouse facility that will be directly managed by them and will allow them to really grow at scale the amount of goods from upstate New York that they bring to New York City. One of the things that is really exciting for us here is that historically the food distribution center is really a distribution center, meaning that if you and me or a resident of Hunts Point wants to go and actually buy food, they're unable to do so. The only folks that can actually buy food are restaurants or supermarket, but people who buy at scale. But we are really next to kind of a low-income community that actually is a little bit of a food desert, and where having access to fresh food is a difficult enterprise, even though they sit next to 12% of the entire food supply of New York City. And so for the first time, Grow NYC will actually have a supermarket component as part of it, so that Hunts Point residents and Bronx residents at large will be able to come and have access to fresh food at competitive prices directly in their neighborhood. And I'm excited about both the ability to bring a different type of tenant to the food distribution center, but also provide a different type of service to the local residents. Switching gear a little bit on resiliency, I think Sandy was a really big awakening for New York City at large. I think for the first time it was in everyone's conscience that we were, apart from the Bronx, a collection of islands with 520 miles of shoreline. The Bronx was largely spared during Sandy because of the timing of the low tide, as to when the water actually made its way up to the Sound. And so as a result, there wasn't widespread damage to the food distribution center of widespread flooding, but I think there was a common understanding that, like, in great part, that was just luck, and there could have been a tremendous amount of devastation. And so since Sandy, we've done a lot of work and studies to just really try to get a better grasp as to what the actual climate risks were to this community. And as you can see, the floodplain is fairly shallow around the peninsula. It does not go deep inland, and it's not very deep in sense of like the height of the water that is expecting either. However, it is a community, and the food distribution center as an asset are at risk of flooding, but they're also at risk of brownouts, which would be kind of equally devastating for the food supply. And so what we begin to look at is like not just really, there's a tendency when there's a climate event that happens that then you really focus on planning for trying to prevent the next climate event, which clearly is never going to be the same that you experience, from happening. And so instead of doing that, we really wanted to understand what were the true climate resilience of this neighborhood. And we really focused on free energy, heat, and flooding. The three of them, whether or not you have a Connet failure, you have overheating and a Connet failure, or you have flooding, lead to the same outcome, which would be that you have tons of food that would go to waste, because the electric system that allow each of these buildings and these tenants to keep their food fresh, per very stringent federal regulations, would not be able to be kept fresh. And the damaging to these systems would also not allow them to be able to recover quickly economically. So that's really like the focus we've had on this. And we want to, and then came out of this strategy what we called a layered approach. That is focused on energy and finding systems that are able to provide us redundant energy if the Connet grid were to shut down for at least 48 to 72 hours, which is generally on average how long a flooding condition would last, or how long a brownout or blackout would last. So really trying to find sufficient amount of energy for 48 to 72 hours has been a priority. Then we've looked at building level mitigation. Luckily, industrial buildings are really often naturally elevated by a few feet because trucks need to load and unload. And so the the ground floor of the building, if you will, is generally the loading dock level of the truck. And so if we had a flooding event, we think that the damage to the building themselves, which are like very strong industrial building, and because we're up in the sound, we're not foreseeing any wave action to actually damage the building. The buildings would not really necessarily be damaged. So it's just making sure, like, how do we prevent to the maximum degree the water from entering the building? So looking at it in a lot more surgical way. And then social resiliency. As I said, this is a small community, but one that is isolated geographically, has a lot of social vulnerabilities because it is kind of a very low income community. There's a big senior population and a big kid population in Hunts Point as well. So, so looking at like specific shelters in the community that we could strengthen so that the 13,000 residents of Hunts Point would be safe. So our energy project is entering its final design. It is a tri-gen microgrid and emergency generators. So the idea is through to basically recoup the heat that is generated through the tri-gen system to be able to provide 48 to 72 hours of kind of backup energy at the level that is necessary to be able to continue to cool endless fridges that exist on the food distribution center. So this is the kind of the technology we have decided to move forward, and we're in final design for this project. We're also installing solar panels and storage at 2 neighborhood schools so that, again, if there is a climate event, whatever that climate event is, and energy is being cut in the entire neighborhood, these 2 places will be fully functioning with AC and all electrical equipment as emergency shelters in the community. And then finally, we just applied in December to a FEMA grant to continue kind of the more surgical building level work to flood-proof 2 of the facilities that are at the closest to the shoreline, and they're most at risk of being wet. So we're very excited about all of this. It's a lot of work that we've put in the last few years to really trying to define the climate, discuss them with all of our tenants, discuss them with the communities, with the elected officials, with the federal regulators, to make sure we have the right investment for the long-term viability of the food distribution center here. And so we're really excited about that, and we're expecting to hear back on our grant application next year, hopefully. And then I'll talk to you a little bit about the vision plan. So in 2004, under the Bloomberg administration, the community, elected officials, and the city came together. I think at that time, and I wasn't with the DC or with the city at that time, but my understanding from colleagues is that like both the community and the city were in a pretty bad place, where the community did not reap any of the benefits coming from, being the host to an enormous city industrial facility that served the city at large, but didn't really serve them. And so there was a need to really come together with a common framework for the future that would serve the community, and that would also serve the interest of the city, which are represented in the enormous size of the food distribution center. And so it was a community developed plan that lasted for about a year and culminated in the development of an actual document, which is called the Hunts Point Vision Plan. And it centered around 4 different topics. The first one was optimizing land use. there were a lot of waste-related, commercial waste-related companies that were occupying the industrial area outside of the food distribution center. And they could operate anywhere, like a new commercial waste management company could open literally right next door a residential building. And so at the request of the community, a buffer zone was created around the residential area where industrial uses were allowed, but a number of industrial uses that are really kind of like toxic and generate a lot of environmental issues could not be located in some locations. So that was a really big outcome of this plan. There was a lot of conversation around workforce solutions to make sure that the residents of Hunts Point could benefit from the very large number of jobs that are located in the food distribution center. And so the Small Business Services, who is the workforce provider for New York City, opened up a Workforce Center 1 right in Hunts Point. So now residents have an opportunity to access and hear about job directly in their community. There was a lot of questions around creating around traffic safety. As you can imagine, there's a tremendous amount of trucks coming in and out of the neighborhood. So again, DOT did a lot of work around ensuring that where there are residential streets where, for example, you have a really important street between like a school or daycare and the heart of the residential community, basically redesign all of the truck routes and created like a design buffer spaces to maximize safety for residents. And then there was a desire for this community who is on the peninsula to have access to the waterfront. And so there were a couple of beautiful new waterfront parks that were created on the waterfront. EDC committed that a portion of the waterfront edge along the food distribution center be built as an esplanade. And so we have also in our agreements with our tenants that if they are to redevelop buildings on parcels that are along the waterfront, they then need to build a public esplanade that would allow residents to access the sound. And there was a lot of work that was done to make sure that the streets that link the residential heart of the neighborhood to these waterfronts actually are also safe. So as a result of the 2004 vision plan, so 15 years of kind of planning and collaboration between the city and the community, we've had about 14 acres of new open space that was created. We've remediated a tremendous amount of land because of like the long-term nature of the industrial occupation of this land. There was a lot of remediation that was needed. There's been a lot of work, as I said, around traffic safety at intersections. And something that I'm really proud to say is that, and it's, I think, a rarity of all the projects and neighborhoods I've worked on, it's really rare that we show up every quarter to the community board to talk about a plan that was put together in 2004, but this is what we did in Hunts Point. So I have members of my team that are, you know, the 10th generation of planner since 2004 that is responsible for the implementation of this plan, who go on a regular basis to the community board to meet with elected officials and organization to report on our progress, be accountable to when the city has not been able to deliver on some of the project that we promised, and just kind of continue the collaboration of making sure this neighborhood is the best it can be for all parties. And then starting last year, or even because last year was such a weird year, I think in 2019, as we were going on a quarterly basis to the community board and to the council member, now council member Salamanca, whose dad was a worker at the food distribution center and is a long-term resident of Hunts Point, there was a common feeling between the city and them that it was time for an update, that we had implemented 90%, as I said, of the 2004 recommendation. And so that a lot of new issues had appeared. So for example, like direct access to food for Grow NYC, or marine highways, or even resiliency and climate risk that were not mentioned at all in 2004, because these were not really issues that anyone was focused on at that time. But it was time for us to come back together. And also new kind of context coming in, which is we are expecting, although now it's being delayed because of COVID and all the changes to the MTA budget, but the MTA and Metro North are planning on 4 new metro stations in the East Shore of the Bronx, including one at Hunts Point, which will allow you to go from Hunts Point to Grand Central Station in 20 minutes, which obviously is going to have incredible implication for that portion of the South Bronx and the type of change it is going to see, because for the first time, it is just going to be a heartbeat away from the economic center of the region. And so we came together with community and elected officials for an update to the 2004 vision plan. We are just kicking off this work right now. We have hired the Pratt's Community Center to help us do community engagement. We are retweaking our community engagement because we had developed it pre-COVID, and obviously given the situation we're in, we cannot reach people through kind of like large meetings in Hunts Point in their community. So we really need to rethink how to engage in a productive dialogue with members of this community, with the tenants, with industrial owners in Hunts Point through different means. And our goal is really to focus and come together with a shared vision for the future of this entire community, including the food distribution center that would guide the next 15 to 20 years of investment. So we're really excited to start this. And there are a number of themes that have come up that will be important. So obviously the one even before COVID is public health and resiliency. This is a community that has like a high asthma rate, high diabetes and obesity rates. So looking at like complete health and the intersection between the built environment and residents' health. Continue to look at economic opportunity and financial health, which is even more important now as we've seen like tremendous increase in unemployment in communities such as Hunts Point. And then really looking at critical infrastructure gaps and both kind of quality of life infrastructure, such as open space or bike lanes or community centers and daycare, but also more kind of brick and mortar infrastructure, if you will, like what is the role of the Metro North station? What are the critical resiliency infrastructure that we need to continue to invest in? So we're really excited about this work. It's one of our priority for the remainder of the administration. And then that's it for me.
Great.
That's just great. I mean, it is really exciting, Cecilia, to hear about the active engagement of the city in this way, in this vicinity around food, energy, water topics, which is our network's kind of focus, and adding, of course, resilience into that. Really, really exciting. I'd like to open the floor to questions. Nuri, Cecilia, Dong, I think you'll moderate the questions.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt the presentation and I couldn't send the message asking for questions, but if anyone has a question, can you please unmute yourself and speak if you want?
Yeah, as an option to help us organize that, if you could raise your blue hand in the participants list, you can raise your hand and that way we can see that you want to speak. I just think I'm struck by a lot of things, Cecilia, but your last comment about 10 generations of urban planners working in this area is great. I mean, it just speaks to the level of engagement. I'm not sure that it sounds like that maybe goes back even before Bloomberg's administration. I'm sure that's true, going back to the origins of the district. but to see the engagement with the community and the growing concern about community access to food, access to the waterfront, these are of course major concerns, and it's just great that you can you're maintaining this this focus. I do have a question, which is maybe a little bit off topic, but it is, you mentioned that this is one of 6 major maritime centers around the city. And I'm wondering if there are similar processes in the other 5 as well. Perhaps maybe not to the same extent, but is the same approach being taken? I know Brooklyn, was it the Bush Industrial Center? There's
That's right, Sunset Park
development.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I think like, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that one and the others. Could you comment on those as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think unfortunately, it really helps where when these areas exist and then are like really occupied by a major city entity. So, for example, one of them is the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is kind of by and large an entity of the city. And a creation of the city. So where you have the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and because you have like one institution that is responsible for the entire campus, it is much easier for the community and for elected official to be able to talk to one person and for change to be realized. So in Sunset Park, where we, EDC, have enormous holdings as well with the Brooklyn Army Terminal and Bush Terminal, there's been similar processes. They haven't necessarily translated into an actual plan, but there is an ongoing task force that meets with the portfolio manager of the Sunset Park portfolio, and similarly from the community's perspective on a number of investments or policy decisions that we're making on our assets. So you have a similar kind of exchange. You have that, as I mentioned, in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, because you have the entity of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But another maritime and industrial area is Newtown Creek, for example, where there you have a very large collection of different property owners, different types of companies. And even though you will have like an industrial business zone provider whose job is to try to coordinate and be the advocate of all of these voices, it is not as if you have like an actual manager of all of the assets and all of the properties that actually allows for this type of dialogue and long-term planning. So I think it's really, and it's similar in Red Hook, which is also one of the 6 where you have a large collection of property owner. I mean, a lot of them is like really the Port Authority, but it's not as organized. And then it's even more fragmented in the North Shore of the Staten Island. So it's really, I think it really depends kind of geography by geography, and it is very based on the type of ownership that you find there.
Interesting. Yes.
I have a question myself. Thank you, Cecilia. I was curious about the Grove, New York City Regional Hub, the supermarket that you mentioned is going to be open there for, you mentioned that it's going to be only for Bronx residents?
Oh, no. So Grow NYC, they're going to have like, so it's going to be a distribution center, but they're going to have a portion of the building that acts as basically all of the food that one can source from the distribution center will also be available, but in like, consumer size in the supermarket. It will be open to everyone. So me will be able to like drive up, enter the food distribution center and go to the supermarket. We probably will not, because it's kind of out of the way of everyone except the folks that live in the Hunts Point Peninsula or right around it, around the Sheridan area. But we're really excited. And also because it's the type of produce that they will be selling that otherwise really the only way you can find them in New York is in like organic supermarkets or in in green markets throughout the city, which are not prevalent in every single community.
Mhm.
So it's also a different type of produce than what otherwise one could have access to.
Thank you.
So I'm not seeing too many hands yet, but just to continue, you know, Cecilia, this is where our series is shifting from what we were doing in the previous quarter, focusing primarily on food, to a segment focusing on infrastructure finance. And obviously this is major undertakings here. And as your bio indicates, you know, you're managing over something on the order of $1 billion plus in projects. So can you comment on how for Hunts Point, how the projects are financed, how the city handles the major investments that are necessary here?
Yeah, and I think it's pretty unique and complex in the food distribution center because we are the city, and because when you are the city and you are an asset owner, or two things. One, your bottom line cannot just be money because you're an entity with a public mission. So our bottom line when we manage our assets in the food distribution center, of saying like we have like, you know, almost like a triple bottom line. Some of it is we need to actually receive rent, but we also need to make sure that the tenant actually meets a mission, and that's something that is useful to the entire economy of the city. And then we need to make sure that the tenants provide a living wage and a quality of work that is in line with what New York City considers a good job. And so that is really kind of how we think through what we're doing. So as a result, each time we have kind of a new tenant that comes in, or we need to make an investment in infrastructure, we need to make sure that we meet all of these goals. Because we are a public entity and government, like the way we build projects in the food distribution center, there's generally like two options. One, if it's an infrastructure project that really is going to serve the entire food distribution center, we pay for it. And we sometimes come in a collaboration with the state, where we're able to put like a city and state money, or sometimes are able to apply to federal grants, like the BRIC grant I mentioned. But it's almost entirety, the almost entirety of the project is financed through public government money. When we're doing a redevelopment project, like the Grow NYC development, for example, then there is a negotiation between the tenants, the developer who are building the building on their behalf, and the city, that allows all of us to leverage the fact that we own this land, and therefore are sometimes able to provide really cheap rent, because we'd rather have a tenant for the next 50 years or 25 years. Like we sign leases at the food distribution center that are generally between 20 and 50 years. So we are really looking to a very long-term relationship with the tenants that is kind of meeting a public purpose. And our financial leverage is the fact that we own the land, and we've owned it before, and we will own it tomorrow. And so we're able to kind of toggle with the cost of the rent in exchange for investment in property itself that we may not be able to finance directly, because we may not have the capital means at that time. So this is generally kind of the way we go about it, where at that moment you have like a public-private partnership. But that is one that really is vetted for the very long term.
But in terms of public-private partnerships, they're really focused around your tenancy and your tenant leases. That you don't have external third-party investors who aren't necessarily an active food distributor.
No, that's right. That's right. We don't do that. And sometimes, depending on the tenant, you know, they will go to a developer who is an industrial developer, you know, to actually build the facility. And so these guys, if you will, are an investor, because they're going to make a certain amount of return they expect as part of putting like forth the building. But we don't have outside investors that way. That's just not the way historically the city has financed his project. And it's generally because he can use capital money with no interest rate over extremely long period of time. It is cheaper for us to use our own capital budget than it is to get funding outside where we may have interest rates or, things like that that make every dollar more expensive.
Right. Sure.
Cecilia, thank you very much for the talk. I have a quick question. In terms of your vision planning, how often do you update it? And especially in this case with COVID, do you see any challenge in terms of food distribution? I've seen news about Grow NYC has been feeding a lot of people that are usually like first timers that go to the food bank. Can you comment a little bit, because there's significant changes in all the factors. Will the vision be updated based on the new challenges coming along?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there were a lot of, in the spring, in March, April, May, June, my team spent a lot of time every day on the phone with the tenants of the food distribution center, major supermarket owners in the city, the National Trucking Association, to try to understand what was coming in, what was not coming in, why. There were a lot of fears at the beginning that truckers would refuse to come to New York City. And so we made a lot of efforts to create rest stops for them that were safe with bathrooms. There were because generally they may do that and go to a Starbucks in a neighborhood or go in a place that is closer to residential area. And so we created places for them, including one in the food distribution center with portable potties, warm coffee, things that would make them feel like they can rest and be safe. Because I think a lot of the narrative at that time was just New York City is the global epicenter of COVID, and almost if you breathe the air, you will get it. There was a lot that we learned. The first one is that the food supply chain is kind of fairly resilient, and even though you could see episodic lack of some products in some places, overall, there wasn't a break in the food supply chain. And what we saw, which was really important for our tenants, in a lot of distribution centers, there's two types of distributors for food in the city. You have folks who distribute to supermarkets. And so these guys were doing kind of really well because it was hemmed up demand. And you had folks who were distributing to restaurants. And they really struggled because all of a sudden, no one was buying their goods. And it's a very difficult job if you are selling a very high-end piece of steak to midtown restaurants, and all of a sudden you need to translate that into selling meat that you could send to a supermarket. The packaging is dramatically different, for example, or the type of food that you will, sell is very different. You're not going to buy a lobster to eat at your home. I mean, so a lot of the distributors, including a lot of the distributors at the food distribution center, had to reinvent their job almost overnight. And we did a lot of work with them. I mean, one of the things we did, for example, is encouraging them to open the food distribution center to individual consumers, which traditionally was not open. So that if you were, again, and I remember we did that with my husband, we went to the food distribution center and bought $200 or beautiful frozen steaks that, were really meant to go probably to a high-end restaurant in Midtown that was shut down, but they existed and they were willing to sell them cheaper, and we could actually go to a distributor in a distribution center to get them. So there was I think there's been a tremendous amount of learnings from distributors about how can I flex my business style and operation so that if there is one type of consumer, i.e. restaurants, that are not able to purchase my goods, I can actually open into a different market. And then on bringing food to New Yorkers, and working a lot with the food pantries and with our colleagues in like the social service administration at HRA. And our team actually created an RFP for a food reserve that basically bought about $50 million of food. We did that, I think, in May, and stored it in different places throughout the region. But this was food that was owned by New York City. It was specific food that could be translated into healthy meals for family. And then bit by bit, we've been able to distribute this food to like different food pantries. So I think a story, because the stories that are being told in general and during COVID in particular are just what they are, but there's an enormous amount of work that the city has done just by becoming an enormous purchaser of food. And distributing this food to food pantries that then can distribute it to hungry New Yorkers. This is a huge piece of work that like is not really being talked about because it's like pretty grim, you know, reality of the pandemic and of what the city had to do kind of early in the spring, but it's work we were definitely engaged in.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is great information. I think Roberto has a question.
Oh, hi. Yeah, my question is, if, for instance, the online activities that actually are taking over now that these COVID times getting stronger, are they presenting any challenges for distribution centers like Hans Point, or for instance, how you guys are embracing them?
By online, you mean like the fact that you need to use technology in order to be able.
Could you hear me?
As a business? Is that right, Roberto?
I'm sorry, I'm having problems with my audio. Will you please repeat?
By online, you mean like the fact that business have to use technology?
Yes, yes. Most people are buying online and they trying to do less.
Yeah. I mean, it was also part of like an enormous learning curve, you know. And for example, as part of like the kind of the distribution example I was talking about, like how do you shift from a restaurant distribution that is really based on relationships and a lot of phone calls and the same buyer from a restaurant coming every single week to pick like, you know, the best produce, the best meat, the best fish that they want, to being able to serve consumer. We really kind of like sometime had to like hold hands with our tenants to be like, you guys should put together a website. Like this is a good example of a website that would allow people to sign up to pick up stuff. And some of them, you know, I think it really, and I think it showed in the restaurants also ability to go, you know, mainly outdoor or not, or mainly people being able to order in or not. Like some businesses are really willing to flex, and others are just like, there's one thing I do well, and I'm not willing to completely change what is sometimes like a free generation approach to selling my goods, and I'd rather shut down, put my staff on furlough, and wait it out. And I think what has been really hard is when you do that, like I think none of us expected that, like, you know, 9 or 10 months later, we will still be kind of like ground zero where we were in March. So some of them over time changed their tune on that. But so I think it's really a business by business decision, and we've seen the psychology of that really differ from one person to the next. But I'm pretty certain that based on how long the pandemic is lasting and the impact it's had, that like I would be surprised if business in the future don't have a contingency plan that they can put in place fairly quickly.
I'm sorry to just follow up on that. Do you mean that practically the distribution point doesn't really get further involved into helping the tenants to adapt, or what you do?
Yeah, I mean, like it's really hard because for us, we're right. So our responsibility is to provide facilities that are, you know, up to par, but we cannot and then we can offer assistance, but we cannot like force business to do anything. So if one of our tenants was like, I'd rather shut down, you know, my high-end lobster business rather than try to completely create a new website and find a new market and sell those directly through consumers, there's just kind of nothing we can do about it. It is really their prerogative. Like they have the ultimate choice of doing that.
Thank you.
I think that we don't have any more questions, and it's 1 p.m.
Cecilia, thank you very much for.
I know, I wish I could show you my face.
I hope we can get you back some other time and to talk with the group in a more casual setting. And if we actually get to come into person meeting sometime soon, hopefully. You know, on behalf of the group, we thank you very much, and we hope to continue your engaging talks in the future. We have many of our groups are actually from Arizona and other states, or we actually had some audience from other parts of the world. So we will be following up with you with further questions. And so if there's no more further question, I'd like to thank Cecilia for the wonderful talk and sharing the information. We will be reconvening in 2 weeks for another webinar on infrastructure financing. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a wonderful weekend and a very happy new year. Be safe.
Thank you for having me. Stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.